The main effect so far seems to be higher energy prices, higher oil prices, higher gas prices. The UK is a net importer of both. We import more than half of the gas we use.
And we use quite a lot of gas.
We use quite a lot of gas, partly because we got quite accustomed to using lots of gas because we have lots of it, we used to have lots of it in the North Sea. And that is bad for the UK. If prices of things that we are importing rise, we're basically poorer as a country.
Hello and welcome to the IFS Zooms In. I'm Helen Miller, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Today we are talking about the spring forecast, which, happily, did exactly what it said on the tin. It was a forecast and not a fully blown fiscal event. So today we'll tell you a bit about what changed in the forecast, but really focus on the risks that the forecast highlights around the government's plan to reduce borrowing. There are risks coming both from the economy and from the government's planned policy proposals. We will, of course, also talk about the risks posed by the conflict in the Middle East, which is a quickly developing situation that has already overshadowed the fiscal forecasts. We'll then have a bit of a health check on the state of the public finances, since that is what will determine or underlie the government's choices in the budget and in the rest of the Parliament. To do that, I'm delighted to be joined by my colleagues, Ben Zaranko and Boileau, to talk about all these things. So, Ben, big picture, before we get into the weeds, what do we learn in the spring forecast?
We learned that the OBR forecasting team have terrible bad luck to have spent 3 months pouring their heart and soul into a new update on where the economy and the public finances are going. Close that forecast, send it to the printers, then events in the Middle East start developing not altogether in the UK's interest, and all of the, well, not all of them, but plenty of the assumptions underpinning it have been completely upended. Most obviously around energy prices and inflation, but potentially many, many other things as well. But the forecast, such as it was looked pretty similar to what it did in the autumn. Things have ever so slightly improved or moved in the Chancellor's favour. There's a modest improvement in the borrowing outlook, but nothing really to write home about, reflecting various data releases and bits of information we've got over the past few months, where broadly speaking, stronger tax receipts and lower debt interest spending have improved things, slightly offset by a number of other factors, particularly a weakening labour market and slightly higher spending on various policy reversals and support for special educational needs as well. But broadly, the picture for borrowing remained pretty similar, which is still quite high, but lower than it was last year, and set to continue falling pretty quickly, actually, such that by the back end of this decade, the government will be borrowing only for investment, as it's promised, and will have debt more or less stable. That's the plan. And this basically reiterated the plan without much else.
So we'll come back to that plan and whether it's likely to pan out as expected. But let's jump in straight on this point about the Middle East. I mean, things are changing literally as we record this. But even since a few days ago, we've seen gas and oil prices go up, the stock market go down, government borrowing prices go up. What should people be expecting? Assuming this doesn't just stop tomorrow, which would be lovely, assuming it drags on a bit, what should people be expecting on the economic front?
I think we don't know whether this is going to be a blip or whether this is going to be a sort of decade-defining crisis yet. It feels like something in between. The main effect so far seems to be higher energy prices, higher oil prices, higher gas prices. The UK is a net importer of both. We import more than half of the gas we use.
And we use quite a lot of gas.
We use quite a lot of gas, partly because we got quite accustomed to using lots of gas because we have lots of it, we used to have lots of it in the North Sea. And that is bad for the UK. If prices of things that we are importing rise, we're basically poorer as a country. It's what you call a negative terms of trade shock in the economic jargon. So this is bad news. In terms of what that means in more practical terms, it probably means higher inflation. How much higher, we don't know. David Miles of the OBR some back of the envelope numbers and said it might be about 1% on consumer prices. If you look at what's happened so far, and if that lasts, that last bit really matters. If it lasts, and you might also then see if inflation is higher, that makes it hard for the Bank of England to cut rates. You can already see that in the market no longer expects the bank to be cutting interest rates in March, when it previously was basically baking that in. You might even see interest rates go up. If you're a business, this clearly is going to push up your costs in terms of fuel, in terms of heating, in terms of electricity. And you might end up seeing real impacts on business activity there. It's going to squeeze household budgets. It's going to put pressure on, if you're heating a hospital or a school, it's going to put pressure on your budgets. all of these things will feed through. It's going to have lasting, or at least far-reaching economic consequences if this proves to be on anything like the scale which it looks like it could be.
As a bit of an aside, one of the things that you and I were talking about overnight, Ben, was that in light of all that, and in the fact that we might be about to see a foreign conflict push up inflation in the UK and potentially push up interest rates, it's a little bit surprising yesterday to see Rachel Reeves use her speech at the dispatch box to note that the previous government presided over high inflation, but in that case, because of a foreign conflict over which they had no control, Rachel Reeves very keen to take credit for falling inflation and interest rates. She will not be as keen to take credit or take responsibility for what might be about to happen.
Right. Just as I feel sorry for the OBR forecasting team doing all that work, having to tear it up. I feel sorry for the Chancellor's speechwriters, presumably having a very nicely crafted statement ready, nice and pithy, only to have events come along. I do think that section of the speech probably could have been rewritten, because basically, if you're going to point to the fact that the last government presided over double digits inflation, driven mainly by global events which it couldn't control.
Meaning the Russia-Ukraine
war. If now this government is at risk of presiding over high inflation because of events in the Middle East which it cannot control, it just feels like you're hostage to fortune there, and you're inviting the same criticism of yourself. And it's just more generally taking credit for cuts in interest rates and reductions in inflation when they're driven by global factors just means that you can't be too upset if you get blamed when they start rising, which we may now experience.
But parking that kind of politics for now, so Ben talked about how, again, we all hope it won't be a prolonged conflict, but it might be, and that would have effects on the kind of real economy. We could be genuinely poorer. But it could also very plausibly affect the government's decisions over how it wants to spend its money. We were already seeing, before anything happened to the Middle East, calls for higher defence spending. Remind everyone what the government has already committed to and what kind of scale we're talking about if the government did decide it wanted to meaningfully increase defence spending.
Yeah, I think it's completely right to say that despite all the uncertainty at the margin, this is clearly going to add to the pressures to increase defence spending. And it's also right to say that those pressures were clearly there well before anything happened in the Middle East over the weekend. So I think current plans for defence spending are for defence spending to be about 2.4% of national income this year, rising to 2.6% by 2027, and then staying at that level as a share of GDP until the end of this spending review period, so 2028-29. The government then has an ambition to increase defence spending to 3% of GDP in the next parliament. And alongside NATO allies, they've committed to increasing core defence spending to 3.5% of national income by 2035. So clearly some pretty punchy increases kind of planned for the future. And I think it's worth noting that the actual penciled-in plans for spending imply that defence spending will be flat as a share of GDP between 2027-28 and 2028-29. I think that current events clearly put more pressure on those plans to keep spending flat as a share of GDP between those 2 years.
And the Prime Minister himself has said that he'd like to go faster. He and his government don't seem to have figured out how they might pay for that faster increase in defence spending. And I think it's worth dwelling on what you were saying, B, a little bit when you said that pressures were already there. It's because we were until very recently thinking about this as, is the US going to withdraw from Europe? Is this more about NATO taking more ownership for the defence of Western Europe and so on? This is a new thing entirely, and I don't think we're qualified to say whether this really changes that strategic judgment, whether this really adds to the capabilities we need, whether it leads to direct costs of just doing operations in the Middle East, whatever. But I feel like in direction, it certainly doesn't feel like it's going to relax the calls for extra defence spending. It feels pretty clear that it strengthens one side of the argument here.
And we're talking about some pretty juicy sums as well. To get spending up to 3% is 14 billion in today's terms.
I think if we increased it to 3% by 2030, which might be one interpretation of the Prime Minister's statement that he'd like to increase defence spending faster, 14 billion is a pretty chunky sum. We could think of that as a penny and a half on all rates of income tax or the main rate of VAT. Of course, it could also be paid for by kind of cutting other spending. But a thing that makes that kind of trickier is that growth in total departmental spending is currently set to be relatively low over the next spending review periods. So we calculated that actually if the government does decide to bring forward that increase in defence spending, does decide to reach 3% of national income by 2030, that could take up all real terms planned growth in total departmental spending within current totals over the next spending review periods. So no room for kind of any increases to other spending priorities without imposing real terms cuts elsewhere.
I think it's worth just almost repeating that to underline it. So basically, the government has penciled in some relatively modest growth in spending. But if it wanted, and it isn't if, it's absolutely a government choice, if it wanted to get to 3% of GDP spent on defence by 2030, that would take up all of the increase in planned spending. So there'd be nothing left for the NHS or education or anything else. So you'd either have to hold them all flat or give some increases to the NHS, for example, and then cut other departments. So this is a beefy enough sum that you don't get to do it, just in the margins. You would have to either really cut back something else the government is doing or raise taxes. And we shouldn't be thinking about borrowing on a permanent basis if you do want to increase defence spending permanently. We'll come back to some of the broader pressures on the public finances and spending. But Ben, the other thing that we're also already seeing potential calls for is support for energy costs. Again, we don't know how it'll pan out, but if oil and gas prices stay high, that'll be bad for all of us paying our petrol bills and our fuel bills. We've become accustomed in recent years to the idea that the government, when these things happen, the government steps in and helps households, and there's obviously some benefits to doing that because we don't like being worse off. But as you said, if this happens, we'll be poorer. That has to be reflected somewhere. And if it's not in household bills, it'll be in the government bills. So again, already calls for doing some of that. If they did do it, there are better and worse ways to go about it.
Yeah, so I think one just simple, tangible one is that there were immediate calls in the House of Commons yesterday for the government to either cut fuel duty or scrap its future planned increases. That's worth bearing in mind that the increases that are penciled in for later this year, this is because last time we had a global energy price shock, the government took 5p off fuel duty and then just basically proved unable to put it back on again, and now has a plan for gradually adding that back on again, which might now get derailed by the latest huge shock in oil prices. But that's one tangible thing. I think more generally, if this looks like anything like what we had in 2022, there's clearly going to be pressure to support at least some households with their energy costs. Some of our colleagues did one beneficial thing, I suppose, of having a once-in-a-generation energy crisis just 3 or 4 years ago means that we have some good evidence on this. And so some of our colleagues have looked in detail at how those support schemes worked. And, there's a few issues which you don't want to get too bogged down in here, but one is about, do you want to subsidize prices? Because if you subsidize prices, you're sort of blunting that incentive to use less gas and electricity. So that's one thing you might worry about. The second is, how do you target it? Can we target it just at the households who really need it, either because they're particularly low income or not as well off, or they've got a big household or a big drafty house that has very high energy needs? We don't really have the ability to do that so well at the moment, unless the government's been secretly developing it over the last 4 years. Fingers crossed. So there's that question as well. And then how you label it, because humans are weird. If you give it to them and say, oh, this is for gas, they're more likely to spend it on gas. Whereas if you just give them cash, they might spend it on any number of things. So there's all sorts of design questions there. The key thing, I think, is targeting it at those who need it most, and whilst preserving the incentive to reduce usage of energy can mean that we get more bang for our buck, protecting those who need it whilst limiting the cost to the exchequer.
And it's worth reminding people that what the government did last time, when we had these energy surges after the start of the Ukraine-Russian conflict, was big. They spent something like £35 billion on these energy support packages. That's like half the education budget. That's what we spend on all of Ministry of Justice and Home Office put together. I mean, these are big, beefy sums.
One-off, though.
One-off, but still, this is a lot of money.
It's a lot of money, yeah.
I agree, it's not every year, but still beefy. So what we said at the time, back at the end of last January, actually, is that if you think there's a world in which you might be putting in place these kinds of support packages, doesn't seem particularly unreasonable to think that actually getting yourself ready with the data that you would need to be able to target support packages in a more sensible way would make sense. Now, I don't know if the government's done that. Maybe they have. We don't know about it. But if they do think there's a potential chance of looking into this winter doing that, they should be starting now, right now. Off you go. Start thinking about how you might design a package of support that's not as bluntly targeted as the last one.
You know, the number 10 data science team has all these like AI fellowships and things like that. Get some data nerds in a room and give them this task for the next 6 months. Build this database as best you can. That would be a fantastic use of public funds. It could save 100 times whatever it costs. I really think that this should be a priority, building the database.
Great. And we look forward to doing a podcast on what that new database looks like.
That'll be one real for the aficionados.
That's what we specialise in. So let's pan out. So we talked about, so there's the big conflict in the Middle East. It's going to have, if it carries on, big impacts economically and therefore in the public finance forecasts. It could have direct effects on spending, either through the defence spending or through calls for energy support. But actually panning out from the Middle East, although obviously it's what overshadows everything, actually, even before anything happened in the Middle East, there was already a big, long list of pressures. I mean, you and others have been pointing out that actually the spending plans for the rest of the Parliament are looking pretty tight, and it is completely plausible that if the government stuck to its plans, you would be seeing some cuts to some departments.
Yeah, I think there's clearly a lot of risks, economic and policy, associated with the government holding to its stated plan. And I think one of the biggest of those policy risks is just what's happening to departmental spending and whether plans for departmental spending at the next spending review are kind of deliverable. So the spending review is set for next year, and that's going to revisit spending envelopes for 28-29 and then set them for 2 further years. And kind of total real growth in those spending envelopes is looking relatively slow. And that's even after accounting for these kind of top-ups that we heard more about yesterday in special educational needs and disability spending. So total departmental spending set to grow by 0.9% in real terms each year on average over the course of the next spending review. That compares to 2.1% from the start of this Parliament to the end of the most recent spending review. So a real slowdown in growth. We've talked a bit about defence spending, and clearly faster increases in defence spending put a lot of pressure on that envelope. But I think there's also a kind of real laundry list of other pressures that are kind of facing the government when it comes to actually allocating those spending totals. And I think it's fair to say when we get to spending reviews, particularly spending reviews where penciled in growth is relatively slow, it's not at all unusual for the government to choose to top up those totals when it comes to actually allocating spending to departments. And I think wouldn't be at all surprised if we actually see totals topped up this time to reflect some of those pressures against kind of these totals.
Okay, worth underlining that what we're not saying is the government can't deliver those plans. The government absolutely could go ahead and deliver, plans that have relatively growth. Spending would still be growing. We could have it growing at a smaller level. But as you said, if history is any guide, governments have often topped it up. This would be a Labour government going into a difficult general election with spending restraint that probably meant cuts to some of the non-protected departments, unless they were going to do something very strict on the NHS. And Ben, one of the things that you and I often point out is that governments have very regularly said, we are going to get borrowing down tomorrow. When it actually comes to doing it, they don't tend to follow through, either because shocks come along and the world changes, and obviously more shocks come along, but also because it's always a bit tempting to just push that back. So there is a real risk here on the policy front that even though, as you said at the top, you have this forecast for borrowing to come down sharply, public finances to improve quite substantially, for us to be meeting a current budget surplus by the end of the forecast period, that really is predicated on the government following through on these really tight plans. So I think it's reasonable scepticism that actually do that.
Yeah, though they've brought borrowing down a bit already. The biggest reductions are set to happen again this year, next year. So once we get to the back end of the Parliament, borrowing's already set to be down to more manageable levels. So maybe the hardest yards will have already been done, and maybe things will get better. Maybe some of these pressures will alleviate. Maybe something will come up that actually makes this more deliverable than it appears currently. But right now, I wouldn't want to be the person in charge of delivering that spending review.
And of course, the other thing we should think about what we learned in the forecast yesterday. So forecasts are always uncertain. We've talked about uncertainty related to policy and what the government chooses to do. There's also always a whole bunch of uncertainty in how the economy is going to pan out. We've pulled out 3 things that we think really stood out from the kind of the latest OBR forecast, which are related to unemployment, migration, and capital gains tax receipts related to asset prices. Let me just take one of those in turn. Why don't we do the CGT receipts stuff first, B? Because it also relates a bit to what's happening in the Middle East. So we've seen that we are getting more revenues from capital gains taxes, in part because equity prices have gone up, but those equity prices move around quite a lot.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think a big part of the improvement, the small improvement that we saw to borrowing forecasts was driven by this higher than expected rise in equity prices between the autumn and now. So we saw an 8% rise in equity prices, and that feeds through into higher tax receipts, primarily through higher receipts from capital gains tax. But as you say, Helen, these things are really volatile. And I think there's kind of two key sources of volatility in these forecasts. First of all, there's the volatility from equity prices themselves, which tend to move around quite a lot. And indeed, since the end of the forecast window used for this forecast, they've then rose 7% more, then have fallen back somewhat since the events in the Middle East. So clearly there's volatility and uncertainty here. I think there's also some uncertainty about forecasts for taxes like capital gains tax, where there's a kind of relatively narrow base of taxpayers. We know that the kind of behavioural responses might be particularly important here. There's clearly more uncertainty for this forecast than there is for some other forecast parts of the public finance forecast. So while this is kind of an improvement, clearly there are some uncertainties here, and perhaps particularly given events this weekend, some kind of downside risks.
It's broadly, we don't want to sit here complaining that the UK stock market has done even better than we thought, right? That's broadly a good thing. It's just that what goes up can come down, and the way that this feeds into the forecast process is that sort of once an increase has happened, it's sort of assumed to be permanent, and then the increases just happen from that higher baseline. So when things get a bit frothy, it can, those paper gains might vanish again sometime in the future.
It also speaks to not wanting to over-calibrate fiscal policy to very small changes in the forecast, because actually it's really remarkable, given what you just said, B, that depending on whether when the OBR exactly had to close their forecast, whether it had been the week they did it, the week before, the week afterwards, next week, would have had a huge impact on that revenue forecast. So again, it underlies that what we don't want governments doing what they've been doing recently is really calibrating policy and tax policy in a very fine-tuned way for these very specific forecasts that actually can swing by tens and 20s billions of pounds in really short periods of time.
We don't often talk about equity prices the day after a fiscal event. I mean, maybe this time it's partly because they fell so sharply on the day we happen to be doing it. But also, of the 12 billion improvement in the tax receipts forecasts, 3/4 of that came from this. So it was just the big thing going on, which led to a slight improvement that gave Rachel Reeves sort of something of a positive story to tell, even if it was overshadowed. But this was one reason why. So it's worth dwelling on, will it last? Will it persist? What do you have to believe about the future to think that this is, going to be a lasting improvement in our position?
And again, great to see that Rachel Reeves sort of resisted the temptation she might otherwise have had to take that, spend it, especially with the May elections looming. Because had she done that, we'd been sitting here saying, well, hang on a minute, they might actually have disappeared before we've even spent them, because equity prices could have fallen back again. So again, another reason why it's good that Rachel Reeves stuck to her plan for not turning this into a fiscal event and trying to eke out some more policy based on these paper forecasts.
Absolutely. We'd be sat here now trying to come up with superlatives for how silly it would have been if she'd spent that, if half of the increase in equity prices had vanished, but she'd already spent it on a permanent increase in something, we'd have been very critical of that.
Although last time I checked, equity prices were actually still up on where they were when the forecast window closed. So I don't think we should over-egg.
That's true, but last time I checked, the conflict in the Middle East is still ongoing. So let's see. But I think it's a good point.
And the point being really that, panning that out from the CGT in particular, is why you said we don't really want to be making permanent decisions based on forecasts that we know for all sorts of reasons swing for tens of... We've just highlighted one bit of the revenue stream. There could be others that are also swinging in different directions. So you just don't want to be flying things so tight. So CGT receipts are one thing. Ben, unemployment. I think there's some concern about unemployment because it's going to go up again this year, but the OBR thinks it will come down. But the OBR keeps thinking that unemployment is just a temporary blip. Not everyone believes that.
The OBR sort of house view, I suppose, is that this is just a cyclical thing. So it's just because demand is weak in the economy is operating below its capacity level. So unemployment will be higher for a bit. It'll nudge north of 5%, stay there for a little while, and then drop back to exactly the same medium-term level that they've been forecasting for a while. That's one view. Another view is that actually there's been structural changes to the UK labour market, potentially driven by or exacerbated by some policy changes that have pushed up hiring costs and labour costs for employers.
So that's the employer index rise, the minimum wages rises.
Exactly, which are particularly pronounced for younger workers or for part-time workers. And so if you believe that story and some other external forecasts, most notably the Bank of England, doesn't have unemployment falling all the way back. It has it sort of settling at a higher medium-term level. And the OBR recognise this as an uncertainty. They've done some different scenario analyses, and one of those would have that sort of scenario playing out, a pretty bad version of that scenario playing out, and would push up borrowing by more than 20 billion a year. Now, it's just a scenario, but the point is, who's right about what's happening to unemployment and where it's heading is a big deal for the people affected, for those people who can't find a job, or those people who can't find a new job that they'd like to move to, or those, all the many ways that unemployment feeds through into people's livelihoods. But also, it's a fiscal risk.
And it does seem like it's a risk on the downside. There aren't many people happy with forecasts that have unemployment coming down faster, right? There are plenty of external forecasts. The OBR looks optimistic on unemployment relative to other forecasters. Okay, then the third risk that we were highlighting, B, is all about migration, where there's been lots of rumblings in the news about net migration, so the difference between people coming and going, due to be falling. The OBR's done some adjustment, but not as much adjustment as we think they might do.
Yeah, so we saw the OBR revise down their estimate of net migration, and that entirely reflected an increase in their forecast for how many people were going to be leaving the UK each year, so outward migration. They didn't make any changes to their assumption for how many people were going to be inwardly migrating. And that revision down is kind of bad for the public finances as forecast by the OBR. Migrants work and pay tax and are less likely to be eligible for benefits on arriving. So lower net migration tends to mean a reduction in revenues. So I think we think it's pretty likely that the OBR are going to revise down their estimate of net migration further, and kind of implying that fewer people are going to be immigrating to the UK. I think that's kind of stated government policy as set out in their kind of migration white paper from last year. I think that's also kind of reflected in some early data on non-visit visas that are being allocated. We're seeing those kind of drop from levels that we saw before. So some kind of early signs that we're seeing a kind of further reduction in immigration. I think the OBR are likely to take account of that data in the autumn budget and kind of further adjust down their forecast of net migration. So that's kind of one key risk for the autumn budget and could have kind of big public finance implications.
And Ben, do you also, so obviously, there's lots of chat about net migration falling. There'll be a reassessment of how far it's falling, if it's falling, that kind of stuff. Do you think we'll also see the OBR change how it accounts for migration? Because it's a bit funny at the moment. What basically happens is that they sort of assume that everything else is constant, all the spending is constant, and they just say, well, there are fewer people, there's fewer tax revenue. It kind of all comes through that. That does look a little bit odd sometimes.
Yeah, I think there's some oddities with how this particular forecast has come about and how it's been presented, and some oddities with how we do this generally. So just in terms of this thing B was talking about, where this is driven by a downward shift. Well, a downward shift in the net migration numbers is because of an upward shift in the numbers of people leaving. But that's not really because we think more people are flying off to Dubai because of the high tax rates they pay. I mean, I especially don't think they're heading to Dubai right now. But it's more a methodological thing, and this is more about the way we count it. And it's more of like a technical change really than anything else. It's just they've reflected that bit now, and then later in the year we'll look again at how many people are coming to the UK. Now, even that alone is important, right? If you think about how we account for this, because the people who are leaving, let's say it's a doctor in their mid to late 20s going off to Australia to do a couple of years, they look different to someone who would be arriving to the UK who isn't eligible for any benefits in their first couple of years, or who might have very different characteristics. Like the composition of inwards and outwards migration really matters. So there's lots of important modelling decisions to be made. Then there's this thing you alluded to, Helen, which is, because the government says to the NHS, you've got this many billions, and we say to the schools, you've got this many billions, and go away and stay within that budget. If an extra 10,000 school pupils arrive, schools are still left with the same budget. So, the spending totals in the public finance forecasts don't change depending on how many migrants arrive. That means that when the OBR does account for the extra tax revenues the parents of those kids are paying, you end up with the tax benefits, but you don't reflect the potential costs and pressures on public services. I'm simplifying a bit, but it means that migration is almost assumed by default just to be good for the public finances. Now, in the short term, it almost certainly is. In the longer term, it's clearly more complicated depending on the composition of people and the age, and they claim pensions too and all the rest of it. So this is something that I think if the OBR looking ahead, they've got 6+ months for the next forecast. This is going to be a big issue. It's a politically sensitive issue. Making sure we get that modelling right and then having it done transparently and communicating it well, I think should be a real priority.
And I think the OBR have said they're going to look more into this for the kind of fiscal risks and sustainability report that they publish over the summer. So I think we should expect to see at least some kind of early results from looking a bit more deeply into this at that point.
Good.
And we're also, I feel like I should flag, we're also looking at here at the IFS. So I hope there'll be lots more to come on the more nuance in the immigration debate. Before we start wrapping up, Ben, I want to make sure we don't be too sort of doom and gloomy, although I think there's plenty of things to be gloomy about. Give us some good news. What was good in the forecast? What caught your eye?
Well, I think the fact that if the forecast had been held a week earlier, this question would have been much easier to answer. Because I think there's things like UK gilt yield, so the interest rate we have to pay on new bonds that the government issues, had fallen quite a lot since the November budget, by something like 40 basis points or 0.4 percentage points. It was quite a big deal. Some of that's now unwound given recent events and global instability, but that's good. Lower borrowing costs and lower debt interest spending is good. I think that inflation's been coming down a little bit faster than anticipated. That's good for households. Until recently, we were expecting interest rates to start coming down this year. This year should be better in that respect. Of course, now I don't know how things are going to pan out. But more broadly, the forecast showed the government does have a plan for reducing borrowing from unsustainable levels to something that looks much more sustainable. They've delivered a reduction in borrowing this year, and they're set to do another one next year. Most things were pointing in the right direction. I think now, we were talking about this just early this morning, I think I now can see a more credible, realistic, a believable story for why productivity growth might now be on the up and might come to ride to the rescue of some of these fiscal pressures. And there's some data showing maybe some positive productivity signs in the UK. Now, it depends a lot on, let's not get into that, but it depends on how you measure it. A lot of that is coming from removing lots of low productivity jobs rather than necessarily adding high productivity jobs, but like a batting average effect. But there is some grounds for optimism, I think, and around technology and AI that at least isn't just putting your finger in the air and hoping for the best. At least you can tell a story about how that might come about. So maybe in 2 years we'll be talking about the fact that debt interest bills miraculously dropped, productivity growth's picked up, and the munificent Rachel Reeves has given us all a big tax cut. So I just don't, maybe not, but
That'd be a fun podcast to do, wouldn't it?
Yeah, no, I'd love to hear that one.
Yeah, upbeat one. Okay, but let's wrap up by kind of looking forward to what we might expect in the next few fiscal events. We said that the big picture for public finances is the same as it was at the last forecast. Borrowing is still pretty high, but there is a plan to bring it down pretty quickly, albeit with some downside risks around and some upside risks, but maybe more downside risks around whether the government can actually deliver those plans and around whether the economy will actually pan out the way we expect it to. Public finances are still vulnerable. Being the next big moment will be next year's spending review. That will be set up in the budget. So what do you expect to see on spending in the autumn budget?
So I think the autumn budget will be the point at which we expect the government to kind of finalise the spending envelope ahead of the spending review next year.
It's like how much they want to spend overall on public services in the rest of the parliament.
Day-to-day and investment spending. So I think it'll be interesting to see if those remain the same, if we've seen any sort of announcement or further news on defence spending kind of over the summer or in the interim. I think that might have an effect. I'll be interested to see the profile of spending as well, whether we still get a rather weird effect where the growth rate in spending kind of drops quite fast in 29-30, then kind of bounces back up in 2030-31.
29-30 being the year when the fiscal rules bind.
Yep, potentially unrelated fact, potentially related fact. Listeners can draw their own conclusions. So I think I'll be interested to see it, as well as looking at kind of total growth and whether that's topped up, whether there's any kind of changes to that overall profile of spending, and what we know about the kind of pressures in areas like defence, obviously, but also things like special educational needs and disability spending, whether we know any more about kind of whether policy changes announced kind of recently have had kind of more of an effect on expected spending.
And of course, it's possible the Middle East will sort of force the government's hand in some sense and make them act sooner. But if we do get to the autumn budget without big changes, then that is the moment the government, should be setting out what it thinks it wants to spend for the rest of the parliament. And then we'll get the details filled in the following summer. Final one for you, Ben. We're all happy over here at IFS Towers that, we had not a fiscal event, that it was a forecast as promised. We got no more sleep as a result. I was thinking we'd get more sleep and we didn't. So that wasn't quite as rosy as I expected. But do you think we will stay in this new world of one fiscal event a year? What's your guess?
I think we do need to give credit for this, because there are people arguing that the government should have used this as a chance to do something exciting ahead of the May elections, or do something exciting to regain the political narrative after a bruising couple of months. And the Chancellor, resisted those siren calls. I think that.
What's I mean? The post-May elections do not look good. Those calls must have been, tempting.
Yeah, I'm not a political strategist, but you can see the case. And I think it's good that the government is sort of, if you putting its money where its mouth is, in a way of saying, policy stability is important. We're actually going to try and deliver some of that. That was good. Now, there was blissfully little discussion of how we're doing against the fiscal rules. In the Chancellor's speech, she mentioned it once or twice. The OBR basically barely talked about it at all, beyond just producing new forecasts. That's better, I think. I think we're having more fruitful, important conversations. About things like what's happening to unemployment, or what does it mean if equity prices have shot up in this way? Those sorts of things matter more.
This is much more exciting than talking about whether the headroom's moved by a few billion.
Well, I don't know. We're not your average punter, and people vote with their feet.
It's more important.
Yeah, it's more important for sure. Okay, but that was all easier because the forecast showed her continuing to meet those rules by a comfortable margin, very similar to the margin by which she was meeting them 3 months ago. Now, had this forecast instead been scheduled for mid to late March, or had Donald Trump pulled the trigger a week earlier or something, would that still have been the case? We don't know, but let's imagine the world where there was some horrible oil price and gas price shock, and the government had felt compelled to announce something. And in fact, Rachel Reeves was actually on course to miss her rules by some small degree. Now, you might say, well, that's a sort of big global event, which means she should be coming back and issuing a response. Maybe, yeah. But had she then stood up and gone, yes, I know that I'm running a small current budget deficit, and I know I told you I wouldn't, but I'll be back in the autumn to get things back on track. That would be, that's what the new framework says she should do. And that is perfectly sensible and defensible. And I think it'd be good if we could have a grown-up world where that was fine. What I fear would instead happen is we'd just trigger 6 or 7 or 8 months of furious, which taxes are going to go up because gas prices are up this week, or, oil price futures have done this. Therefore, does it mean pensions tax relief is going to be changed? And the ceaseless speculation that plagued us last year. So I don't think this really was the test of this new operating model. That will come at some point in future, probably. But for now, it held. That's good. We should take the small wins and say well done to the Chancellor and her team.
I absolutely agree with that. I think, absolutely, Rachel Reeves deserves credit for sticking to it. And of course, it opens up a bit of a question about when you think this second forecast should happen. It is a bit odd that we're having it just 3 months after the last one. I think it's basically a hangover from the Gordon Brown days, where he had a pre-budget report in the autumn and a budget in the spring, and therefore the pre-budget report was like a few months earlier. Ben's frowning at me.
Yeah, a bit, but we decided we shouldn't do budgets in March, because if you want to make tax changes that kick in early April, it's just not long enough. So we should do the budgets in November. But then we didn't move
the earlier one.
Yeah, but then we have legislation that says the OBR have to do 2 forecasts every financial year. So at some point we'd have to, if you want to shift to a July-November model, you'd have to 1 year do 3 forecasts probably, which is bad for the OBR and Treasury staff trying to plan their holidays. I don't know.
There's clearly a transition.
We could solve this. And we probably should.
And there's clearly a case that having the statement more in the middle, or as a kind of a pre-budget, let's have a quick look and then we'll take action in 3 months, would make more sense than doing it just 3 months after the budget.
We should also fix and legislate the dates. That's the thing when you get IMF assessments of the UK fiscal framework. The one thing where they go, this is weird. Well, there's many things that we're weird on, but one thing where they go, this is weird, is that it's basically up to the government when to do it. Oh, I might need an extra 2 weeks to get that past my backbenchers, therefore I'll delay it. If we just fix these in stone at reasonable intervals, that would help provide some certainty.
Okay, well, let's come out of the weeds of fiscal event timings and let me wrap up. So we had a fiscal forecast yesterday, and it was a forecast and not a fiscal event. And as we said, Rachel Reid deserves credit for that. The big news in the forecast is not how the forecast has changed. It's November. There have been some changes. They are small relative to the uncertainty around any forecast. The news really is the forecast itself, and the big picture remains the same. Debt is high. Debt interest costs are high. Borrowing is high. The public finances are in a fairly vulnerable position. The government does have a plan to bring borrowing down pretty steeply in the next couple of years, but that is predicated on some pretty punchy assumptions about the government increasing taxes in the run up to the general election, having some pretty tight spending restraint in the run up to the election. It also assumes the economy will pan out as we expect. There is always uncertainty around that. At the moment, it looks like there's more downside risk than upside risk, not least because of the conflict happening in the Middle East at the moment. So we should all hope that the conflict is ended very quickly for all sorts of reasons, and more broadly that the economy pans out better than we expected. But I think we should be realistic about the fact that there really are these downside risks. So we should hope we get to a better public finance position, but it's perfectly plausible that we won't. But for now, let me say thank you to Ben, thank you to Bea, thank you to all of you for listening. If you like this video, please do share it with your friends, like it, subscribe to our channel. And if you want to support this and other such work we do, you can become a member for as little as £10 a month. You can check the link in the episode description. Thank you.